Here we are, in the middle of nowhere. We landed about 5 a.m. Jim was there to meet us. He had the shack finished. We call it the sheep shed. It's 10 feet by 12 feet. You can imagine the 7 of us make a pretty tight fit. We'll start clearing sagebrush tomorrow. There's a lot to do, but we'll get along all right.
Early Columbia Basin settlers arrived with whatever they could fit into a suitcase and a few trunks. Most were rough-cut and determined, ready to start from scratch in sagebrush and greasewood-covered desert.
The summer heat hung over the vast, endless prairie like a hot canvas tent. Once in a while, a slight breeze waved through the bunchgrass and sagebrush, which was as tall as the cows' backs.
They arrived with visions of prosperity fueled by the raw determination of people on a mission. The pioneers of Grant County came to live their dreams on the frontier of eastern Washington with nothing to lose but bad luck. A 1905 map of Washington state showed the Columbia Basin as arid and not productive without irrigation. Settlers made do with horsepower. If they needed something and couldn't make it with what was on hand, they did without. When the wind blew, it covered the road and every crack in the shed with sand, and those farming on dry land prayed for rain.
It was a 7-mile drive after water each way. We took 3 barrels, the butter churn jugs, a few milk cans, anything that held water, even the wash boiler. Water was the most precious thing to be had. It was always 11 o'clock by the time the water wagon came back home.
In 1908, the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company put the first hydropower plant on the Columbia River at Priest Rapids. The plant contained 2 900-kilowatt generators. It was powered by water carried to turbines through a natural rock diversion channel. The plant furnished power for pumping water to nearby farms and orchards. Those lucky to live close enough to receive electricity produced by the plant became prosperous by shipping their fruit and vegetables to Seattle on the train. Ephrata, the county seat, 48 miles east, didn't get electricity until 1916, 9 years later. Nat Washington recalls what it was like.
Our system came from Mr. Nelson with a generator in his garage, and not a large system at all. And so we had only one light in the entire house, and it was a drop cord over the dining room table. And when anybody wanted to read, you gathered around the dining room table to read. And if you had to go to another room, you carried a coal oil lamp. So that was really the beginning of electricity in Ephrata.
L.R. Nelson, a local entrepreneur, supplied electricity to Ephrata. His daughter, Louise Gustafson, remembers her father.
He had a reputation for just being able to solve any mechanical problem. He was fascinated with electricity, and I think that it was part of that fascination that caused him to want to bring electricity to Ephrata. He eventually made a deal with the city to provide electricity for street lights, and then to provide electricity to anyone else who wanted to buy it. And so the city issued him a franchise to do that. The reason that he became devout, you might say, about electricity was that a big part of his business, his machine shop business, was working with orchardists and their deep wells. And he would be often called out to an orchard or a farm where they had a well and something would go wrong with the pump. And so he'd just pack up and go out there and stay there until the work was done. So it was not unusual for him to be gone several days during a week when he was on one of those kinds of jobs.
Farming was the fastest growing industry in the Pacific Northwest. During the first decade of the new century, farm values increased 300%. Washington state wheat was being exported to England and Asia and represented 45% of the value of all crops. In the waning last year of World War I, when bread was rationed in Britain, Columbia Basin farmers were urged to increase agricultural production. In 1921, wheat harvest wages were 75 cents to $1 for a 13 to 14-hour day with room and board included. Meals were served in a cook's wagon where girls got 50 cents a day for preparing meals. The growth of agriculture in the Columbia Basin was limited only by the generosity of Mother Nature. The land was fertile and the growing season long, but without water or some means of getting it, there was no reason to stay. When Washington Water Power announced that it would spend $300,000 to build more than 70 miles of lines to furnish electric power for the development of more irrigation land, Columbia Basin farmers were elated. In 1922, Washington Water Power bought L.R. Nelson's electricity franchise.
He sold to accommodate the orchardists. He knew that he did not have the resources to bring in three-phase power that was needed for these deep well pumps.
The arrival of 24-hour service was marked by a huge celebration on the Ephrata Courthouse lawn.
We celebrated it with an electric jubilee, with the first electric barbecues. It was the first barbecue that they knew of where the barbecuing was done not with hot coals but by electricity. It happened over on it was done on the courthouse lawn. The pit was dug, and the big two steers were barbecued. People came in from all over. It was the first one of the great big event as far as Ephrata was concerned. The Electric Jubilee.
The cost of building electric distribution lines to serve the far-flung homesteads and family farms scattered throughout the basin proved to be an unworthy investment for Washington Water Power. While encouraging the use of household appliances in rural communities, little was done to bring electricity to farms.
He thought he had an agreement with them that if he sold to them, they would then bring three-phase power to the county. And they didn't. He was so angry about that he and some other people in Ephrata, and I believe the Claps were among them, decided to boycott Washington Water Power for a period of time. And so I can remember when we used Coleman lamps for our light at night because we cut off our electricity for a period of time.
Construction began on Grand Coulee Dam in late 1933. Columbia Basin farmers would not gain the benefit they sought from the power produced by the dam. Transmission lines carried the power west to Seattle and Portland and east to Spokane. Throughout the Depression, farmers in the basin persevered with either no power or poor electric service with high rates. FDR's New Deal set out to organize rural communities, redistribute the population, and promote family farms. The Columbia Basin Irrigation Project was a perfect poster child. It was promoted as a project to create a planned promised land of small farms. It was the largest single reclamation project undertaken in the United States. Fueled by efforts of the Washington State Grange in 1930, voters approved Initiative Number 1, enabling farmers and citizens in rural communities to enter the utility business. On November 8, 1938, Public Utility District Number 2 was created by Grant County voters. In June of 1942, the PUD had 4 employees, 24 miles of line, and 511 customers. 3 years later, they began acquiring the Washington Water Power distribution system and were serving over 2,000 customers. Power requirements after World War II expanded rapidly. Many homes contained washing machines, refrigerators, and other small electric appliances. The Northwest was growing rapidly, and so was the demand for electricity. When Stan Busenbark came to Ephrata in 1945, there was still an iceman in town delivering to a few customers.
Then after the war got started and everybody got to buying electric ranges and everything, then it was a mad rush for electricity.
By 1948, the Pacific Northwest experienced a power shortage. The Korean War fueled defense industries, including energy-intensive aluminum production in the Pacific Northwest. A flood on the Columbia River in 1948 prompted the U.S. government to authorize the Army Corps of Engineers to develop a dam at Priest Rapids. Money from Congress for the project did not materialize. In July of 1952, the Grant County PUD filed an application with the Federal Power Commission for a permit to investigate building a dam at the Priest Rapids site. One of the first things they had to accomplish was to get the federal government to deauthorize the Corps of Engineers' unfulfilled proposal to build a dam at Priest Rapids. The PUD also had to stop the Washington State Power Commission from interfering with their efforts to build Priest Rapids Dam. The little PUD, which had grown to include over 5,000 customers, did not have the revenue to pay several $100 million for a new dam, but that didn't stop them. Bob Gillette remembers what happened in 1952.
The discussions began on the Priest Rapids project, and the Grant County PUD was urged, it was a mutual understanding between the PUD and the Chambers of Commerce that the PUD be urged to pursue the Priest Rapids project as a county project. It was scoffed on by many people, including bankers in the initial stages, because at that time our annual revenues from the distribution system were less than $1 million.
Nat Washington was the PUD's attorney.
The news began to break, and what is Little Grant County PUD? How do they think they can build this great big dam? I mean, we had the legal right to do it. You can't raise the money to do it unless you've got the security. The security is keeping whatever power Grant County needed and selling the rest to Seattle, Tacoma, other PUDs, Washington Water Power, Puget Sound Power and Light, all have great credit ratings. And most attorneys thought I had rocks in my head that Grant County PUD could do it, but the law is just very, very short. PUD has the power to generate, sell, transmit, produce electric power for use within and without the district.
Priest Rapids Dam was financed by long-term revenue bonds retired through the sale of power. This bond issue was the largest ever offered in the United States. No tax money or government appropriations were used in construction. After completing site studies in 1954, Harza Engineering recommended 2 low dams instead of 1 high one at Priest Rapids. On November 4, 1955, the Federal Power Commission issued the Grant County PUD a 50-year license to construct and operate the Priest Rapids Dam. The PUD purchased the former Hanford Irrigation Company power plant and demolished it to make way for the new Priest Rapids Dam. On July 9, 1956, Merritt, Chapman, and Scott was awarded a contract. Work began 2 months later on the first dam. Priest Rapids Dam was one of the largest lump-sum, all-inclusive hydroelectric project contracts ever awarded to a single bidder in the country. Within weeks, trailer courts sprang up in the desert. In the summer of 1956, the town of Mattawa, 8 miles north of the dam site, grew from a dusty hideaway to a bustling little metropolis, serving the needs of construction workers. Paul Parker was one of the early arrivals.
Nobody really knew where Mattawa was. Finally, I found a guy in Moses Lake that told me he thought it was someplace near Beverly, and that was on the map. So we just drove down here, and it was a real desolate-looking country. There wasn't nothing, and finally I seen a little teeny sign here at the bottom of the hill that said Mattawa, and I looked up the hill, and you still couldn't see anything. And we came up in a little town of trailer houses and all construction workers, and 500 people living here, probably 250 trailer houses, and mostly people that could pick up at the drop of a hat and leave, go to the next job.
Gene and Paul Bloom came to Mattawa in 1956. Paul went to work for Merritt, Chapman, and Scott as an operating engineer.
You could barely get up the hill. The sand was so bad. There was nothing. And there were 3 or 4 trailers in the trailer court the day we pulled our trailer in. And then from there on, people just kept coming, depending on what phase the dam was, which workers. The batch plant people and concrete people were one of the first ones, the earth movers. Electricians didn't come in till later.
Don Hill was one of the first employees to work on the Priest Rapids project.
From Vantage clear to Priest Rapids, well, except for a little wide spot in the road called Beverly, there was nothing.
The construction of Priest Rapids Dam was a coup of monumental proportions for the public utility district, farmers of the Columbia Basin, and the power purchasers whose customers would benefit from a new source of power in the vibrant and growing Pacific Northwest. Norm White came to the Columbia Basin in 1946. He remembers what it was like.
When I first came to Ephrata in 1946, there were less than 1,000 people in Ephrata, and probably around 400 in Ephrata or in Quincy. Moses Lake was a very small town. Soap Lake, these was all very small towns. George didn't exist, but I look back now, and I say without Grant County PUD and the construction of Priest Rapids and Wanapum Dams, we would not have what we have today, because without power, we'd had some irrigation, but it would have been all gravity flow. But with the electricity and the pumps that we have had since the inception of this project, we've created a Garden of Eden here in Grant County that could not exist. I think back of the old sagebrush and driving miles without seeing a residence. Without that power, there was no way that this development could have gone forward in the manner that it has. It just couldn't do it.
Fred Wilson came to the area in the summer of 1957. He went to work for the contractor as a hook tender on the whirly cranes.
I worked at Grand Coulee Dam started in 1949 and worked there through 1950. Grand Coulee was the beginning, but Wanapum and Priest Rapids produced the power and the water and stuff for on down to Pasco. And the farms, made all kinds of farms where there was sagebrush when Priest Rapids started. They're orchards and prime farming country in there now. Really a nice farming country.
Construction at Priest Rapids began during the low water season. Pete White came to work for Merritt, Chapman and Scott in February 1958 as a crane operator.
Basically, building a dam requires you to move the river. This sounds a little incongruous, I know, but we actually move the river from one side to the other side. We dry up a section, work on that, move it over here, and work on the other section and so forth. The powerhouse was always dry. The spillway we built in two sections. And we actually moved the river from side to side to get around that.
Steel sheet piling was driven into the riverbed, creating a temporary cofferdam, enclosing a 38-acre area for construction of the powerhouse.
A cofferdam is a temporary dam. And what we used down here were steel plates. They're about 60 feet long. And they interlocked on each side, and you build them in a circle. And what we did out there on the west side, we built a temporary cofferdam out of wooden timbers to slow the water down. And then after we got that built, then we went back in and built the other cofferdam out of the steel plates, because then we wouldn't have to put up that rush of water trying to get through there.
Moving a river was tough and dangerous work. A cofferdam failure could be disastrous. The closest port city where heavy equipment, parts, and supplies could be shipped to the construction site was over 200 miles away. A bridge was built to accommodate equipment that came in on rail cars along the west side of the river.
The turbines and generators were all built in England, English Electric, shipped over on ship by ship to Longview, Washington, offloaded over there onto railroad cars and brought over here on a railroad. To get those things over to the right position, they had to have that bridge with the railroad tracks on it. It was also a truck bridge, so they could bring all the material over to the east bank where it was stored until it was needed. But the bridge was a very important link in that project down there, because without it, there'd been no transportation between both ends of the dam.
15 Euclid Model 63 trucks with 14.5 cubic yard dump bodies transported the rock and gravel. Material from Priest Rapids Dam would fill 202,438 trucks, each holding 16 cubic yards. Lined up bumper to bumper, they would have stretched for 1,150 miles. Construction started at bedrock.
They blast that rock out of there and haul it out with ukes and big trucks, dump trucks, all they can load. And then after that, there's a lot of the small stuff that you load by hand into big metal skips, and they hoist it out with the whirlies and dump it into the trucks. So there's a lot of detail work there that really don't meet the eye. You know, people think they get it all out with the big shovels and cranes and stuff like that, but they don't. There's a lot of it that's handwork. And after the bedrock is clean, then they wash that with water, clean it all off, and then before they start pouring mud, and they do that section at a time. You know.
Potholes, cracks, and fracture zones were cleaned out before final clearing with air-water jets. Foundation basalt was then covered with a layer of thick grout. A huge aggregate storage and concrete mixing plant operated on the west bank of the river. Portland cement arrived by the trainload and was mixed according to exacting standards. On April 25, 1957, landing 2 hours late on a dirt landing strip near the dam site, Governor Albert Rossellini, Senator Henry Jackson, and Senator Warren Magnuson presided at the ceremony before the first pour of concrete.
This dam is a tribute to the determination of the PUD here in this county and the PUDs in this state to see to it that we keep pace with our power requirements. I'm frank to say that this type of undertaking should be a federal response.
More than 844,000 cubic yards of concrete and over 45,000 tons of reinforcing steel went into the construction of the dam.
Before they put any concrete into it, there was an inspector that came through and would inspect the form and the rebar and make sure that everything was in proper position and also properly braced to hold the weight of the concrete before it hardened. Because liquid concrete is very, very heavy. A 4-yard bucket of concrete weighs about 12 tons.
Concrete was set in layered pours. Surveyors placed tacks where pours would be made.
The grid of the dam was broke up into numerous little numbers, and they had names on them like 10, 13B was a certain unit 10, 13 was B would tell you that what area that was or what segment it was, and right next to it there might be 10, 7D. Well, you knew that what height that was and where it came in, and all these numbers kind of meant something to you. And the B or the D you'd know which pier that was.
Concrete curing took 7 to 14 days. The concrete had to be kept at 50 degrees or above for 3 days.
When you pour these mass pours, the concrete builds up so much heat as it hardens that they keep it wet to keep the heat down.
Every concrete pour was inspected. By February 1958, 1,479 men were employed, making an average of $3.50 an hour. Many of these men were experienced hands who had worked at Grand Coulee or Boulder Dam.
But the skilled labor was all experienced when they came there. They were old hands that had been come from Grand Coulee, Boulder, and these other dams that had been going on over the years before Priest Rapids.
A lot of the guys had worked on Grand Coulee, and it was always a big joke that, well, that ain't the way we done it at Coulee. That's where most of these guys had learned was from other places, where they'd learned their craft.
The heat and wind that blew through the river channel slowed, but never stopped construction.
There was a lot of hot days when the lunch pail sat in the back of the station wagon that we were out doing field survey and stuff on there, and 100+ degree days, and a bologna sandwich was not pleasant at noon. But
3 shifts worked around the clock to meet the contractor's deadlines.
The Whirlies were always busy, and they couldn't get around to all the people. The carpenters would need lumber, the reinforcing people would need steel, pipe fitters would need a piece of pipe set, the electricians would need a transformer set or a piece of equipment, and we were always busy. And at Priest Rapids one time, I worked 3 months, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day on construction. And that got to be a grind. Got to be a pretty heavy grind after 3 months, 7 days a week.
Although women were not allowed on the construction site, they worked in trailer shacks that served as offices. Gladys Carr worked as a secretary for English Electric.
Recognition of my ability as a secretary was the most important thing in my life, my business life at that time. I didn't care. Sure, I wanted people to like me, but I wanted for them to think, when they thought of me, Gladys is a good secretary. That was the important thing.
I was foreman in Priest Rapids for a long time, but there's one thing I never did. I never asked one of my men to do anything that I wouldn't do. I had some men that could do things I couldn't do, but I never asked one to do anything I wouldn't do, because if it wasn't safe for me, it wasn't safe for him.
All 10 generating units at Priest Rapids Dam were operational by July 1961, several months before their scheduled completion. Over 1,000 people attended the dedication of Priest Rapids Dam. Luther Hodges, Secretary of Commerce, was the main speaker. Another speaker, 8-year-old Lenora Salazzi, remembers that day.
But by the time that day came, I had it memorized. I had it all memorized because that's part of the teaching. You remember everything you're taught. I had to just get up there, like my mom would say. She'd say, you got to go up there with dignity and honor. You got to show them that who you are, what you're saying, you mean what you're saying, because this is what your elders are saying.
Her father and uncles had signed an agreement with the Grant County PUD that would allow them to continue practicing their religion at a longhouse near the tail race of Priest Rapids Dam. On March 19, 1959, bids were advertised for the construction of the second dam, 18 miles upriver. The dam was named Wanapum in honor of the small band of native people that had occupied the surrounding area since time immemorial. The Wanapum people continue to live at their ancestral village alongside the tail race of Priest Rapids Dam. A construction contract was awarded to Grant County contractors led by Morrison and Knudsen in July 1959. Work started the day the contract was signed.
Wanapum was so far ahead of schedule because it was actually built high and dry. A lot of people don't realize that. And we didn't have any major floods during the construction. So we never had to worry about any spilling over into the Crawford dams into the dam itself while it was under construction. And this put the contractor, I believe, probably about a year and a half ahead of his actual contract date. They were supposed to have it completed.
Fred Wilson finished work at Priest Rapids Dam and moved upriver to work at Wanapum.
The first thing you pour is the sill. That's where the gate sets down on the bottom, the concrete. And you pour that sill first. And then when they start the piers, where the gates come up and close off, then you start the gate guides. And those gate guides, they're set. We'd have marks. The engineers would give us a mark to go by. And we would start the gate. They put a form in. And then we would put our steel inside the form. And we had a tolerance of maybe, quarter inch plus or minus, or maybe 3/16 plus or minus. And we had to set those gate guides to that tolerance so that the gate would run up and down those guides when they were finished,
Three brothers, Bob, Will, and John Wren, worked together on Wanapum Dam. Following in their father's footsteps, they spent most of their careers working on dams. Will Wren was a carpenter.
You was usually in a crew of 10 to 15 men, and you had a foreman, and you had a couple labor helpers, and the foreman had a general foreman, and the general foreman had a walking boss, and the walking boss had a superintendent, and it was just a chain of command. And in the morning, working for the Piedmont crew, which was the project manager, he took all of his superintendents, and they met him at dark 30 in the morning, so to speak, and he had breakfast with them, and if they needed chewed out, that's where it happened. And he told them how much he wanted done that day, and believe me, they busted butt to get it done. I mean, it was imperative that you get X amount of yards poured or X amount of things done, because the whole project is on a schedule. If you were starting off a bedrock, you build what they called a BIP. It's built in place, and you'd follow the bedrock and get it on a level plane at the same elevation. And they would pour that much up to start it, and then you'd set the first set of forms on it. And they'd be wood, and you would tie them down and pour a 5 or 7 foot lift, and then you would change to a steel form after that, cantilevered, so that they didn't have to have so many steel ties to hold the top in line. They worked off in a cantilever system off of the concrete wall below. And then you just keep raising those on up.
12 tainter gates that hold water back between the piers are as wide as a city lot and as tall as a 6-story building. In 1961, they were the largest gates of this type in the world.
Like on the spillway piers, the trunnion blocks that the big gates that open and close, that's all second stage when you set fine anchor bolts and stuff like that, and in the powerhouse for setting anchor bolts for mounting the machinery, that's all second stage concrete. To watch them bolt up those huge arms on the spillway gates to bolts that I had set, and it worked. I think that was the most impressive to me, being a young man and being new to the engineering aspect of construction in a huge way like dams are. You know, you have to take pride in what you do individually in your life, but to see a massive structure like that go together in pieces and everything fit, I think was a lot of satisfaction to me.
Will's brother Bob was also a carpenter. He began work on Wanapum Dam when he was 27 years old.
When I got there, it was water everywhere. Every place you went to work, you were wading in water. And perhaps you wouldn't be wading in water when you went to work, but you're probably wading in water in the afternoon. Everybody was just rush, rush, rush. And if you didn't rush, 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 you went down the road. Wanapum Dam was the first dam on the Columbia River that the draft tubes were made of steel. And all this was put together with steel forms. And we worked for, I think it was either 3 or 4 months on the first unit, the very first draft tube, and we were getting nowhere. And one day this carpenter superintendent come down through there, and he was wading in water about, I'd say about 2 feet deep in the bottom of this hole. And he came in there and he said, "What's going on here?" And I just started to laugh. And he reared back and he threw his hard hat back on his head and he said, "What's funny?" I mean, he was dead serious. And I was too. And I told him, I said, "Well, you've got a crew up on top on this side. They're trying to raise the draft tube up. We're down here on the bottom and we're trying to cut it loose. You got another crew up there on top. They're trying to push it down, and another crew down here on the bottom, and they're trying to take it another different direction." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You got 4 crews in here, and we're all working against one another." So he said, "Well, now," he said, "I'm really serious, Bob." He said, "And I've been at this game a long time." And he said, "I'm stumped. What would you suggest we do?" I said, "Well, you need to get rid of 3 crews out of here." He knew he was up against it, and he knew that there was this gross problem we were having there. I mean, like 3 or 4 months with 4 crews, and we were getting nowhere. So the very next words out of his mouth was, "Come Monday morning, you're going to take this crew, and I'm going to take your foreman, and I'm going to make a walking boss out of him." And he said, "I'm going to give you 1 week to set these forms. 1 week. And he said, if you don't have this set, you are going down the road." And he turned and looked at John and he said, "And you're going with him." Well, we didn't set it in 1 week. It took us 2 weeks. But from then on, we set it in 1 week.
The powerhouse contains 10 generating units manufactured by General Electric. Each 87,500 kilowatt generating unit turbine has a 120,000 horsepower rating. 62 million gallons of water flow through the turbines each minute. Starting a new generator took several days.
When startup actually started, a man would go in with his lunch pail, and when he went home, he still had his lunch pail full. You didn't stop, you didn't eat for 8 straight hours. You worked continuously, it never stopped. I could see why they didn't give us lunch hour and coffee breaks. If you had a chance to grab a cup of coffee, you grabbed it. Otherwise, you were on the go. If people don't realize it, when we first started the control room, we didn't have any alarm lights for them generators. We didn't have a door. We had insulation boxes stuffed up in front to hold the noise down. We didn't even have chairs to sit on. No elevators. No telephone room. Like I say, you're flying by the seat of your pants. And when you push a switch, you're not really sure what's going to happen.
On January 18, 1964, all 10 units at Wanapum went into commercial operation, making Grant County PUD the third largest non-federal producer of hydroelectric power in the United States. As of December 1965, the general contractor recorded a total of 5,768,491 man-hours that had gone into the building of Wanapum Dam.
There's 1,500, 2,000 men working side by side, and you work damned hard. And sometimes you're kind of working against each other, and sometimes you're working in unison. And most times you're working in unison to construct this thing.
On June 4th, 1966, Wanapum Dam was dedicated.
When you look at that, that's not just a dam, that's a real piece of engineering. That's a whole block of Class A, Class B, Class C concrete, and massive amounts of steel and wood, all that stuff put together to make that dam. And the months and the hardships and the joys of working together, putting that thing together, it gives you a lot of pride.
Water and power to irrigate crops make it possible for Columbia Basin farmers to produce over $500 million worth of crops annually. It has been almost 100 years since the Petracks and Odegaards, the Overens, Mackenzies, and Johnsons, and many others arrived in the dry sagebrush and greasewood-covered Columbia Basin. Their struggles remain in what few diaries and photographs are left. The landscape they remember has yielded to their greatest hope, a garden to help feed the world. Those who contributed along the way have helped make a difference for everyone who lives in the Columbia Basin today.
I think there's only one thing to say here today, and that is to express the thanks on behalf of the people of the Northwest to the local leaders who conceived this project, and in the face of great skepticism and very considerable resistance all along the line, carried it through to the point where we see it today. It was no easy task. And certainly this area is to be congratulated for having men of such vision and such perseverance and such ability that they were able to put it over. The legislative job which was necessary in Washington was long and arduous And the Grant County Public Utility District had its representatives there almost constantly. Most of the time, Glenn Smothers and Frank Bell. And certainly they were two of the bellwethers seeing that this project was undertaken, which means so much to the Pacific Northwest. Only we who live here know how badly we need this additional electrical energy.